Last week, when we discussed the Torah and its impact as a document on the Jewish people and on Jewish history, one of the aspects of the Torah that we looked at was as creation myth. And in that, every culture necessarily, or maybe it's the human yearning or human nature, that we need to explain why things are the way they are. And we collect stories and explanations in lieu of science. The empirical method, remember, is only about 800 years old, and we haven't had experiments and control and all of that, and science based on observation for any longer than that. As recently and as well recorded as Socrates, of course, science and physics was based on philosophy. In other words, one imagined how things would be, one logically thought out how they were, and that was an explanation, that's how things were. So the Socratic thinker would look at the heavy object and at the light object, and know very obviously that if he dropped these two objects simultaneously from the same height, that the heavier object would arrive sooner, until so many centuries later, when Galileo actually dropped the two objects, discovered terminal free-fall velocity, and found out that they strike at exactly the same moment, with a different force of impact, but they strike at the same time. So, but we have explanations. Why are things the way they are, and what are the positions for these things? As we progress this week to the book of prophets, one of the things that the book of prophets answers, along with, when we examine the prophets, we're also going to look at the writings, at Ketuvim, at the Tehillim, at the Psalms, at Divrei Yamim, the Chronicles, at Ezra and Nehemia, at the Megillot, along with the prophets. We're just really doing the Bible in two parts, because we also have to look at the prophets with Deuteronomy. We have to stick on the end of the Torah, and then we have to add to it the Ketuvim as well, to look at what impact the document has had upon the Jewish people in antiquity and down to modern times. It is also an explanation of why things are the way they are, but not as in the Torah explaining why the universe is the way it is, why the seasons are the way they are, and the sun and the moon and the stars, why the nations are in their various places, and who are the fathers and progenitors of all these nations. Beginning with Deuteronomy and continuing throughout the prophets is the explanation of why things are the way they are politically and socially. From Deuteronomy onward is an explanation for the legitimacy and the validity of the monarchy, the priesthood, the temple cult and service, the various laws and halachot that pertained to Jewish life in biblical times. There are explanations in there and cleanup jobs for the origins of the monarchy, and there is consideration of the popular folk myth that must have endured. The popular folk myth must have been based on a good deal of fact. There are embarrassing stories and anecdotes that most nations' chronicles omit or do not include in their histories, or even their so-called secret histories. When you read the secret history of the Mongols, Temujin, the Genghis Khan, is absolutely spotless. He is a shining hero without any flaws. And the same is true generally of origin myths of various dynasties. David is, as they say in Chinese, bashmutzt. He is full of stains. He is full of discrepancies. His behavior is anything but pristine. He kills a lot of people. He dallies and has an affair. He arranges for a murder of a rival. And we have built into the Torah as well precedent for some of these things that are going on. But the code beginning with Deuteronomy, and then the stories from the times of when the prophets opens with Joshua and the judges, clearly point to bolster the monarchy. Deuteronomy talks about the duties of the priesthood, and it talks about the responsibilities of the monarch as well as limitations of the monarch. We may have, at least one, if not the earliest, constitutionally limited monarchies in at least recorded human history. Monarchs have always had their limits by tradition. Even Pharaoh, who was a deity, was not the chief Olympian. But we had a truly legally constituted monarchy. The monarchy was also a sacred monarchy, a messianic monarchy. It is a sanctity that is not rivaled by necessarily, but connected to that of the kihuna, of the priesthood. And it is the sanctity of the priesthood more than the duties or the rounds of their sacrificial obligations that we read a lot about in Leviticus. That's more of the nature of their sanctified position that's given to us in Deuteronomy and beyond. Now, you might ask the question, and I'm so glad you did bring this up. In the books of Joshua and Judges and 1 Samuel, we don't have a monarch yet. Why are these stories included in there? And the reader of these stories would immediately, in this context, answer that they are to show how lousy things were before we had a king, how much we need one, and all the terrible things that might befall us if we don't maintain this institution of the monarchy. So Deuteronomy sets out certain basic laws of the way the monarchy is to proceed. A king may take a maximum of 18 wives. That's it. David took 18. That's precisely right. David took 18, the legal maximum, but his son Solomon, there's the Hebrew school child who was sure that King Solomon was a great animal lover because he had 700 wives and 300 porcupines. But no, he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. He had 1,000 women. And we learn one of the purposes of the story of Saul.
That's indulgence.
When we read the story of King Solomon, we are reading it through the eyes of the sages. We are not reading the text anymore. If you go back and you read the text, beginning just with the second chapter in 1 Kings, and it goes on just for about 10. I think Solomon dies in the 11th chapter. Read the story just in the text and try to banish from your mind everything that you know about Solomon. Now, in this will be Solomon's famous, when he first ascends the monarchy, cut the baby in half. He will have the dream wherein God offers him anything, and it is wisdom that he asks for, and God tells him, good deal, because through wisdom you can acquire all the other things that I was trying to bribe you with. But when we actually see the deeds in Solomon's life, he had style, he had an eye for grandeur, and he was a very foolish man. Both politically, if we know the history of the time, and personally. We see that he breaks the law of the wives, and that he says, well, that's just for regular folks. But I am the intellectual elite of kings, and I know that these women won't distract me, and I know I can stay on the straight and narrow path. And then read in 1 Kings that idolatry is brought into the palace, and King Solomon worships idols. It says so. Did he really worship idols? The Gemara jumps on this very quickly. The Midrash says, and that's brought down several places in the Talmud, tells us, Chas v'shalom, we can't deal with this. We just can't deal with the fact that Solomon may have been an idolater. So we say, no, Solomon was never an idolater. But what's the deal going on here? Idolatry was practiced by all the foreign wives and concubines from the other nations, and because the household was his responsibility ultimately, he was not just the king of the nation, but the Balabayit, the Balabas. And because it went on his watch, so to speak, it's as if he participated himself. Wonderful Medrash. Oh, how we clean up this dynasty. But look in the text. Solomon worships idols. So there are various discrepancies in here, various warnings about the wrong way to go, and the story is connected to the Deuteronomic Code specifically to show what happens if you violate it. Joshua is an origin myth or a creation myth, not really, but in this context to say, how did we come to be on this land and hold this land? And it supports the information given to us already in the Torah that these Canaanites are a foreign and different people, and that we come from another place, and we are chosen to have and hold this land, and we have stories